Welcome to the Life's Hard, Succeed Anyway podcast, where you will hear transformational stories, positive encouragement, and practical strategies to help you grow your mindset, reach your potential, live your dreams, and experience a purpose-driven, impact-filled life. Here's your host, Alan Blaine.
All right, this is Alan Blaine, and I'm fired up to interview our special guest today, Steve Borden. Steve wrapped up his college football career at the University of Kentucky in 2015, and he spent the next several years bouncing in and out of the NFL training camps, tryouts, and ultimately never landing on a roster. However, during this time at Kentucky, he had significant exposure to the field of sports science through athlete tracking technologies. So we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So he's leveraged that experience to acquire a position at VALD, where he spent 3 years working with pro athletes, or pro teams, I should say, and special forces groups to monitor athlete and warfighter performance. In 2021, VALD launched a sister company called SAGA, which is a direct-to-consumer health technology brand, which he now manages. Additionally, he's interested in practical strategies for overcoming fear and stagnation. So he discusses these topics both on solo episodes as well as with amazing guests on his podcast. He's married to his beautiful wife, Gazelle, and they have one son named Harper. Steve, welcome to the Life's Hard, Succeed Anyway podcast. You ready for this?
I'm ready to do it. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm glad to have you on here and excited to learn more about what you're doing and your story and all the golden nuggets you have to share with our listeners. I've shared just a brief intro with them about obviously who you are and kind of where you're at today. But if you could take us back and give us the 30,000 foot view to go a little bit deeper into more of your background and how you ended up where you're at today.
Yeah, I think American football really kind of set the stage for me. I've been a competitive athlete most of my life to some degree. And my background in American football, as you mentioned, is probably what led me into a lot of the positions I'm in today. It's where I had my initial exposure to athlete tracking technologies, and which is why I'm working with the company VALD that I am now. And I think it probably spurred an interest in me in improving physical and psychological performance. And so the combination of competing as an athlete and then being around this field of sports science and tracking technologies and all of that has just kind of fostered this spirit in me where I'm very, very interested in those things. I'm interested in seeing people succeed at the things that they're interested in. And so that's where the idea of the podcast came from and part of why we're talking today.
I love it. So tell me a little bit more about your football career before we jump into this. I mean, you played how many years at UK?
So I had a bit of a rocky road to get to UK. I had to go the junior college route. And so by the time I got to Kentucky, I only had 2 years left of eligibility, which, wasn't ideal. But to answer your question, I spent 2 years, my junior and senior year, competing at Kentucky.
And what position did you play there?
Played tight end. Hardly knew anything about the sport of football, which is hilarious by the time I got there. But there I learned how to run routes the right way without, knocking into people. And I learned, a bit about basic coverages and things like that I was very ignorant to by the time I got there.
And why do you think that was? I mean, I know when we were talking before, you were sharing how in high school you played, if I remember right, quarterback, tight end, and maybe even defensive end. I can't remember, but you were a multi-position athlete. Is that why, or is it another reason?
I think a good chunk of it comes from when I played in high school, I played 8-man football, which for the listeners, most people who watch football will know there's 11 people on the field at any given time on offense or defense. But the style that I played was 8-man, so it's very different. And so a lot of the basic coverages are different, the looks are different. And so then I go off and I played at a small Christian college because I graduated high school. I didn't have very much interest. Nobody was looking at 8-man schools. And so I had a little bit of exposure at a small Christian school, but again, the level of competition there was very small. I played D-end, just kind of used my athleticism to bully people around a little bit. And then from there, went to junior college and again, was still bouncing around different positions. So never really adapted to the game. There's probably a lot of things that I would do differently now. Looking back, I would have learned more about the game. But I get to Kentucky and I thought that I thought I knew what I was supposed to do until I got there and realized, oh, you're several years behind a lot of these guys, like from the mental aspect of the game. So there's a bit of an adjustment period there.
And that didn't stop you?
No, not at all. I mean, it never crossed my mind to, quit or hang my head. For me, it was just a huge eye opener that there was a lot that I didn't know. And it was definitely frustrating because I was used to just kind of using whatever athletic ability I had to get things done. But you can't do that at a certain level. And, when you're competing against really top tier talent, everything changes. But yeah, it all worked out, I think, in a pretty decent way.
What would you say is one of the most valuable things you learned during those 2 years? Maybe about football, but maybe just about life, maybe just in general. I don't know. You can take that any direction you want, but that you learned during those 2 years at University of Kentucky.
Yeah, I remember a couple things. One, because you're an athlete, but you're also a student. And so I remember seeing students that weren't athletes. And this is not like a us versus them thing. It's just students that didn't compete. I'd be having conversations with some of my friends that weren't athletes, and they'd be complaining about the workload of, class and finals and all that kind of stuff. And I remember thinking, all you're doing is school. Like, that's your job right now. Like, I'm going to spend 60 hours this week to some degree training, football, whatever else, watching film. And so all that to say, it feels to me that my exposure to football really created this high threshold where everything else kind of seemed easy. And I imagine, somebody who fought overseas, SEALs, all that, they would look at what I do as it's laughable in comparison, but they probably feel a similar way where after that, what else is going to seem difficult? And so it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that significant challenges, and that's relatively speaking, I don't think being a college athlete is that difficult in the grand scheme, but challenges in that sense really just set the stage for they increase your threshold. So to me now, it's exciting in a lot of ways because I'm able to recall, yeah, but that was difficult, but look how easy it made everything else. That would be one. And then the other thing is just, I stressed every single day about, everything was about getting to Division I my whole life. I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to have a good game this week so my film looks good. And then I finally made it. I got my offer. I had a couple offers. I ended up choosing between Texas Tech and Kentucky. And the second I got the offer, there was no celebration at all. It was just immediately my mind shifted to, okay, now I got to be good. Now I got to get a starting job. And, I got to make sure I get enough reps so that I get drafted and all that kind of stuff. And looking back on it now, I realized how much I stressed. It didn't accomplish anything. And so I could have gone back and worked just as hard, but enjoyed it a lot more by understanding that there's always going to be a next hurdle. And you may as well just enjoy the ride and adapt as you go.
So good, Steve. And it does, like you said, it does not take away from the fact that we can grind, we can hustle, we can work hard, we can give 110% and still enjoy the process without stressing about it. I love that.
When you worry, you suffer twice. I always remember that.
Yeah, so good. You spent 3 years working with pro sports teams and special forces. Well, let me back up. So after college, I don't want to skip that. So after college, you obviously you didn't quit easy because even though you weren't drafted by the NFL, which is it's amazing to me, just the level to even compete at a D1 SEC school like you did, and you're in the top of the top of the top of the top of all, youth athletes right out there, even high school football players out there. And then to go to the next level, the NFL, it's just, again, that much more, just such a small percentage. But that didn't stop you from trying, even though you didn't get drafted out of college. How long did you keep going that route of hitting training camps and tryouts and all the things, trying to land on a roster?
It was 3 years.
Wow.
So I finished in 2015, was in camp with the Jets, Chiefs, and then just 3 years of, in and out phone calls. We think we're going to bring you in for camp. never mind, that kind of thing. And I got married in 2016. So, there's the stress of you got to put a roof over our head somehow. Right. And so I eventually just hit a point where I thought, okay, if I'm super lucky, if I have the best career ever, I'm going to be retired at probably 35 at my position, and even 40, let's call it 40. Somehow I pull a Tom Brady and, even at a skill position like tight end, I'm going to be a young dude at 40 and I'm going to have a whole life to do all these other things. Football is going to end at some point.
Yeah.
So, that was what ultimately made me okay with the decision to, pursue other things.
Wow. So how much of I got so many questions for you. How much of a role did your father being an athlete? And I know, as you were sharing with me, even to this day at I think you said 63 years old, still competing, if that's the right way to say it, in professional wrestling. How much of a role did what you grew up, I guess, seeing him do his thing play in your what you pursued and your determination and your resilience, I guess, to spend 3 years, even after college, going at the NFL thing 2 years into your marriage, it sounds like, if I'm doing my math right.
Yeah. I mean, it played a role for sure. I think the football thing, it came to my mind on my own. But what I really learned from him was, anytime somebody asked me, what did your dad teach you? I always, just the first thing that comes to mind, he taught me discipline. He taught me nobody owes you anything ever. He taught me hard work and, humility and all of those things that I think carried me longer than I would have gone without them. Mm-hmm. And so he definitely played a huge role. And then just watching, it's one thing to teach, it's another thing to do. And, I knew a lot of the early groundwork that he laid for the success in his career was before I was old enough to understand what was happening. But I at least, when I'd speak with him, I've heard stories of, he would 330 days a year, he was on the road and he's doing house shows for $30. And he's like, I spent $25 to get here, So I understood the level of work that he put in to get to where he was. And I knew that it wasn't just a lot of work for a year or 2 years. It was, 5-10 years before he had any sort of material success. And so always having that, I was always tacitly aware of that. And I knew that the nice thing about football too is nobody cares who you are. I never once got a starting job or stepped on the field when I shouldn't have because of who my dad was. Right. Nobody cares. Coaches are worried about keeping their jobs, right, and they're worried about making sure that the paycheck still comes in. And so I think that's one thing that I liked about football in comparison to wrestling. For me, it would have felt potentially like I was riding the coattails of my dad a little bit.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I've heard people say, I love your point that you said, he was willing to grind it out for 5 or 10 years before he really had any, I guess, measurable level of success. And I've heard someone say, I've worked however many years for my overnight success. I mean, it almost seems like sometimes people have overnight success, and certainly some do. But I think the overwhelming majority of people, at least in my experience, that are successful in business, in anything, sports, whatever, it's like there were many years of behind the scenes, of hard work and all the things you've done for all these years that have helped you obviously lead to the level of success that you're having today, Steve. And I want to talk a little more about that. But before we do, you said you had worked 3 years with pro sports teams and special forces groups to monitor. I want to hear about that, to monitor performance. I want to hear a little more about what that was all about, or what you're doing today.
So for the listeners, when you're watching football and you see, Tyreek Hill ran 22 miles an hour, those GPS units, that technology would fall under kind of the field of sports science and athlete tracking technologies more specifically. And so I had some exposure to companies like that during my time at Kentucky because we used that stuff. We were the first university to ever start using that technology at scale. And so because of my exposure there and obviously my time as an athlete, that's why I landed at the company VALD. So I spent a couple of years in and out of NFL tryouts, realized I got to get a real job. I got to make some money, and ended up seeing something through LinkedIn that this company VALD, that was much smaller at the time, was looking for somebody to manage their Western region of the United States and Canada. And what that meant is VALD produces different technologies. We don't do GPS tracking, but there's different pieces of technology that athletes, and in the case of military, I brought up special forces groups, can use to track performance rehabilitation. So a simple example would be something like force plates. VALD produces force plates. You'll stand on them. You do things like squat and jump, and it's going to tell you very intricate details about how you're moving. Are you landing with more force on your left leg? Are you producing force more quickly on your right leg? Things like that. And so what I did for VALD over a period of, and I still do to this day, the last 5 years, is help, the professional college teams on the West Coast, Western half of North America, and military groups onboard that technology, utilize it to its fullest capacity, and understand kind of what they're seeing from the data. Because it's one thing to have a bunch of data. A lot of people will wear whoops or Oura rings, and it's kind of cool to see some changes over time. But what do you actually do with that data? And so that's where part of where my role came in.
So you're working, you said, with special, besides colleges, I guess college teams, special forces as well.
Yeah, across pretty much all branches of the military. So the SEALs down in Coronado, Army, multiple different special forces groups, a ton of cool groups. Yeah, certainly.
And what's the biggest technology that you are using with them? How are they using it?
That's a good question. It really depends on the goal. So VALD has grown really fast. The vision, the leader of the company, Lori, is just a visionary guy, and his co-founder Sam and Chris, who helps run the company, that they're all visionary, big executors. And so we have, 9 different technologies now. So it really just depends on the goal. But I would say, in simple terms, that the force plates are one of our top products. So they can be used in a number of ways, but a real simple one is managing and managing levels of fatigue. So when athletes, and this would be the same use case for the Rams or any other team in the league as far as how they'll use these force plates. One of the ways they'll use them, which is when we're, I guess for warfighters when they're training or when they're deployed, and for athletes when they're in practice and in season, fatigue accumulates over time. And one of the first places that it manifests is power production. So the ability to produce force really quickly. And one of the things you can test on the force plates is relative power. So how quickly is this athlete producing force? How not just how high are they jumping, but how quickly can they make that jump happen? And so, special forces groups and pro and college sports teams will use this tech to track changes over time and start to see hopefully early indicators of fatigue, since power is very sensitive to fatigue. So people, this will be somewhat relevant. A lot of people wear Whoop bands and Oura rings right now, or even Apple watches, and they'll tell you your heart rate variability, and as a supposed indicator of fatigue. And that's somewhat unreliable, but it's also a lagging indicator, meaning if your HRV is low, you probably something started days before, where something like power production is a faster, earlier indicator potentially of fatigue. So that was probably a longer rant than you asked for. But that's one way that the teams could use it.
I love it. Is that the most common thing that you're using or that you're personally working with, is the plates?
Potentially. I mean, we so a year and a half ago, I want to say, VALD acquired Smart Speed. So when you watch the NFL Combine, you see those lasers that athletes run through to track their 40 speed. So we have those systems in house now, which are really cool. Laser timing gate systems, and then there's other systems that will measure asymmetries and imbalances and strength and things like that. Some devices are a bit smaller and more useful in like the physical therapy setting. But yeah, it's kind of, we have the gamut over here.
Love it. All new to me. So I'm intrigued and so interested to learn more about that, but I won't belabor the interview here on that. What would you say, Steve, has been a practical key to your success? I mean, you're not a super old guy yet, but you're already doing some great things. You obviously had a great deal of success as an athlete in the top who knows what point, whatever percent of all football players or any athletes for that matter. And now you're having a great deal of success here professionally. What would you say has been a key?
Man, I would say practically speaking, thinking about, the end goal, and then first off, accepting the fact that it's probably fairly simple, whatever needs to be accomplished. Like I think we overcomplicate. We tend to think that the mathematical formula to achieving what we want is very complex, but as soon as we figure it out, the work's going to be really easy. When I think in most cases, it's usually the reverse. The answer is really simple. It's just the work is hard. And so we spend so much time trying to make sure we can tidy up this perfect formula. And then once I have it figured out, once I have like the diet plan figured out, then dieting will be super easy, or fat loss or muscle, whatever. And so first accepting, okay, it's probably not that complex. I don't need to spend a ton of time drawing, the path from here to, Canada. So starting with the end product and then just working backwards. And the practical steps in that are, I just time block my day. So I pretty much know exactly what I'm going to do every hour of every single day of the week. And I don't go to bed the night before without understanding, at 5 a.m. or whenever my workday starts, this is exactly what I'm going to do. And then I remove distractions when I'm in those time blocks. So I try to keep types of tasks together. So if you looked at my calendar, you'll see colors. I'm probably not doing anything novel. I'm sure there's plenty of people that do this, but creative work tends to be, the stuff that would be the hardest for me to do in the afternoon. So scripting podcasts, scripting content, things like that, idea generation, I'm always going to do in the morning when I'm not going to get phone calls. And operational related work, I tend to push off to the afternoon because I don't have to be as on point to respond to emails and kind of check boxes off. So practically speaking, is just accepting that, okay, this is all I need to do is execute. Things will work out. I just need to execute and I need a time block. And so, I look and I go, I have a creative block from, 5 to 8 a.m. And these are the creative tasks that are going to be in that block. And then same thing for operations and growth and all the different categories that I have.
I love it. I do something very similar and I think is very wise. What would you say has been one of the bigger challenges that you faced at this point in your life?
Well, first one that comes to mind is a recent one. Just, my wife and I just had our first daughter, Harper. And so I've just mentioned that every minute of every day pretty much is allocated to something, and scheduling. That has not been the case for the last, 6 or so weeks. My wife also had a bit of a recovery period after that was extended longer than we anticipated for her pregnancy. So, for whatever reason, Harper's not on a schedule yet at, or the first couple of weeks of life, she wasn't on my schedule. So adapting to that has been interesting. But again, I don't think this is a monumental challenge. It's just something that's in front of me.
Right. I know you had mentioned earlier that one of the big challenges that you'd faced is just the whole identity thing after the football was taken away. I don't know if taken away is the right way to say it, but after the football was no longer part of your life. And I just know I kind of, identified with that because that's, I won't spend much time talking about me, but that was something that, I went and I played football in high school, but it was baseball that I played in college. And my identity was I was a baseball player, and my future identity was I was going to play Major League Baseball. At least that's what I believed. And that's what I told myself. I imagine you had the same belief, or you wouldn't have spent 3 years trying, right? Post college. And then when that was gone, I really wrestled with, what is my identity? What am I doing? Who am I? And I don't know. So that resonated with me. I was curious if what you kind of went through in that season of life and what kind of challenge that was. So I think a lot of people deal with that. It may not be athletes. I know a lot of athletes do, but I'm just saying, I think a lot of people really struggle with their identity and what they're doing.
Yeah. I think there was a few things that contributed to, before we started recording, we were talking about my body weight. I played at 250 to 255 pounds. So 110 kilos for people overseas, something like that. And when I stopped playing, my body weight kind of stayed the same, but I lost a lot of muscle. And so there's the physiological component of like, I got pretty sloppy. I was not looking or feeling my best. So there's kind of this separate physical component of being super unhappy in that capacity. But then there was the element of the identity, which is what we talked about, which is what you were just mentioning, which is my entire life was spent thinking I'm going to compete at this level. So there's the internal identity side, and then there's also just practically speaking, every day up until now, I've had something coming up. We have game on Saturday. I have practice today, film tonight. And all of a sudden that was gone. And I always thought that it would be easier to know what I was going to do next, because I planned on, I'm going to play for 10 years, make a ton of money, and then I'll go do my own thing. I'll start my own company or whatever at the time that I decide. And obviously that's not how it worked. And so what ultimately led me to kind of accept that reality was just understanding, as I mentioned a bit ago, that even if I was lucky, I could compete until I was 35 or 40. And then I would have the rest of my life, hopefully 100 more years or something to do something else. And so the road was going to end. It was just a matter of when. And so just kind of having a very practical awareness of the fact that, look, your identity can't always be this, because no matter what, you will not play until you're 100 years old. So either deal with it now or you're going to deal with it in 10 years. The time scale is the only thing that changed.
So good. So good. So I would imagine during that 3-year season, and probably plenty of other times in your life leading up to that, you had some negative self-talk. I mean, this is a question actually, but did you have negative self-talk in that season? And how did you handle, if you did, how did you deal with it? Because you obviously dealt with it to continue moving and to keep going and compete at a high level like that with hopes of landing on a roster. You're not messing around. I mean, you're taking things serious at that point, and had been for years. How did you deal with any negative self-talk? Because I think a lot of people struggle with that. How are you dealing with that at that point in time?
Yeah, there was a couple vectors of the negative self-talk. One of them was just that, it happened probably quicker than I would have thought. And so it was the first time in life that there was a finality to the fact that I didn't accomplish what I set out to do. I had faced a lot of struggles getting to college ball, but I made it. And so there was always this, it's fine. There's a road in front of me. It's difficult. I'm not there yet. I've taken shots to the head, but there's still a path to me getting there. And this is the first time that I had to accept the fact that, this is over. And so there was that element of it. And then the other element was just the fact of, what do I do now? Because I had always kind of made up my mind that I wanted to do something, and then I did it. And I remember thinking, I was in a confused place for a long time of just, I'm actually unclear what direction I want to go. I always assumed that when this was over, I would just make up my mind that I wanted to do something and I would do it. And I seem to live in this floating state that I think a lot of people sit in, which is a very anxious place to be, which is a lot of unmade decisions. I sat in a place of, I think I could do this. I think I want to do this, but I don't know. And I couldn't quite put the pieces together to figure out how to take that road. So then I would look at a different road, and I just basically stared at an endless sea of opportunity in front of me and directions that I could go, with an internal kind of awareness that I could probably pull off any of them if I spend enough time, but I just could not get the dots to connect. It was like, I don't know what direction to go. And I think that was probably the most difficult part at the time, was going, am I not as sure of myself as I always thought I was? I always thought I was very sure of myself, but now I'm sitting here and I'm kind of unsure what path to even take and whether or not they'll work out. And so I think that was a bit challenging at the time.
So what do you say to somebody that's listening to this episode right now? They may be 18, 20, 25, 30, and they're still, or any age for that matter, wanting to pivot and change careers, but they're at that stage where they're in that, I'm not sure which direction to take, where to go. What would you say to them? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I heard Alex Hormozy say the other day, Um, you can get pretty good at almost anything in about 20 hours of focused work, but most people spend years delaying that first hour. And I think that that's for somebody who has a lot of a lack of clarity. When you're unclear, we tend to stand still and just analyze every direction that we could possibly go. And at that rate, you're pretty much in a forest, and you don't know where to go. But you're also not accomplishing anything by standing still. And so you're much better off going the quote wrong direction in most cases, just by starting to find your footing. Because by taking some action, if you stop thinking about it as taking the perfect action and just start thinking about it as taking action, it's not even about going in the right direction. It's about becoming the person who takes steps. So you're just flexing that muscle, developing that muscle of being the type of person who is not paralyzed, who takes steps forward. And so as you go, I think you'll learn. If you're supposed to go, at a 30-degree angle and you're moving 34, you'll adapt and learn over time. And if a year later you realize I probably could have done something else, you just spent a year getting better and honing yourself, and becoming stronger and more capable. And so, look, if you've been sitting in the same spot for a long time, don't expect any changes until you start taking steps forward.
So good. That's great advice, Steve. I love that. If you could go back in time and give your younger self some advice, what would that be? What would one of those things be?
I think it would be to kind of what we mentioned earlier. I stressed a lot about everything and I didn't change anything. I think I stressed about every little thing that came up, and how I was going to be the best I could be. And just looking back on it, realizing that you can, through discipline and effort, and realizing that it's possible, shift your mindset to just accept the current situation, when there are things that are outside of your control. And so it would be really simple. It would just be, just take a deep breath, enjoy the ride, work just as hard or harder, but enjoy the ride while you do it.
Great advice. And kudos to you for figuring that out as quickly as you did. What advice would you give to someone else who's listening to this episode and they're right in the midst of their struggle? They're trying to find their identity. It may be some other completely different struggle, some health challenge, relational challenge, financial challenge, doesn't matter what it is. What advice would you give to them?
Man, I would just say almost everything is practical. I think there's this element of, mechanical versus chemical. And we tend to wait for chemical changes first in the brain or in the body that, at some point I'm going to feel like I want to work out more often, or I'm going to feel like I want to do this. When it's much more difficult to control the chemical, but we can control the mechanical. We can control the movement of our limbs in most cases. And we can control the action and the steps that we take. So, all the things, if you sat down and said, what would the version of me that I was pretty proud of do? If you step outside yourself for a second, oh yeah, I'd probably work out consistently. Cool. I'll do that. Yeah. I know that when I drink a ton every night before bed, I end up feeling lousy the next day. So the good version of me wouldn't do that. And just make a list of those things and then do them, and your life is going to be awesome. That's
great advice. I love it. I love it. Just some 30-second type quick questions. Do you have a favorite success quote by any chance that you'd be willing to share?
I think I just quoted it earlier. I think that Hormozy thing, like the practicality of it, like there's so many awesome quotes. If you don't lose if you never quit. I think that stuff is awesome. But at the end of the day, like I think it should hit home for a lot of people that just don't delay that first hour of you can, if you dedicate 20 hours to something, you'll figure it out. You want to start a podcast? Be in a closet for 20 hours. You'll figure it out.
Yeah. We've both learned that, haven't we?
Yeah.
Just do it. Get started. Take that first step is the hardest. What is one habit that has helped you become successful? Maybe something you do daily?
I mentioned the time blocking earlier. That's been monumental for me. The other one would just be frequent movement throughout the day. I think we tend to work and then maybe work out after. I try to take 10 to 15 minute walks multiple times throughout the day. There's plenty of separate conversation, but plenty of physical benefits to that, but also cognitive benefits. So getting the heart rate up is even better. yeah, frequent movement's a good one.
Oh, that is a good one. 10 to 15-minute walks is your go-to, besides your daily workout. How often typically?
Just whenever I try to get through my block. So, it might be 90 minutes, it might be 2 hours.
Yeah.
And bonus, if I can kind of get my heart rate up and breathing a little bit, there's some benefits, potentially some cognitive benefits to that burn you feel in your legs. That lactate gets shoveled up to the brain. Some pretty cool stuff where you can get some really cool benefits from that.
I love it. And then you live on the coast of Southern California where you've got perfect weather pretty much every day just to go take your walks outside, I'm sure, right?
Well, it's the best. Stare at the ocean. You're going to be in a better mood.
Oh, absolutely. I love it. What is one of the better pieces of advice you've ever received from somebody?
I mean, just back to, I would say my dad, because most of what I've learned practically has come as a result of just understanding that excuses don't get me anywhere. And so just be disciplined. Don't make excuses. Nobody owes you anything has been the catalyst that's put me in the position that I'm in for most of everything else I've learned.
I love it. That's great. And for those that don't know, you said your dad, what is your dad's stage name or wrestling name? You said
Sting,
professional wrestler. I love it. And right here on my wall, you can't see it on camera, but directly to my left, one of my favorite quotes, since you mentioned it, is you can't deposit excuses. Said a different way, you can create excuses or you can create results, but you can't do both. So choose wisely, right? I mean, to your
100%.
point. What's one book that you might recommend for our Life's Hard, Succeed Anyway audience, Steve?
Oh, good one.
Are you a reader? Are you much of a reader or not?
I've started to adopt reading, but I tend to read. So like in the context of this, it's like right now I'm reading Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. So the context doesn't fit. But there's one, Evidence-Based Habit Building by Melissa Brown. She's a PhD in neurobiology and human behavior. That could be a good one.
Evidence-Based Habit Building.
Yeah.
I have not read that. Sounds like something I would enjoy. I love it. And what would you say is your definition, Steve Borden's definition of success?
Yeah, I actually was fairly satisfied with the answer I had earlier, and I'm trying to remember it verbatim. But I think it's taking consistent action in the direction towards the set of goals that you have. So being able to execute and consistently. Everybody has different levels of goals. So if we try to define success by, money or anything else, that definition doesn't extend broadly.
Right.
But having a goal that is fulfilling and then taking consistent action towards it seems to be a good definition.
I love it. Progress. Said it differently.
Yeah, progression.
Right? You're progressing. You're making progress. I think we're wired for that. We all want to make progress towards something that we care to make progress towards in a good direction. So if we're doing that, I think you kind of mentioned that earlier when you may have had a hard journey to get to a D1 SEC school. But you were making progress at least, and you could see where you were going. When you get to the point where you can't see where you're going and you feel we're not making progress, it's hard to feel like that's a success in whatever area of life.
And just being fulfilled in the process is the heavy hitter, because the process is the entire time.
Right.
It's like, even if you make the NFL or whatever your goals are, a new process begins when you get there.
Right. 100%. That's so good. What excites you about the future? When you think about the future right now, today, what is something that excites you?
I think what I'm most excited about is just to be able to continue building what I've built. I think the podcast, have a refreshed ideas on how I'm going to execute there. And just be able to enjoy the ride. I think I'm at a place now as of the last year where a year ago I had a very specific point in time where I realized the stress is literally always going to be there. So I've been pretty successful at just pushing out those things. And so when I'm working, I'm heavily invested. And when I'm not working, I'm heavily invested in that time with my friends or family or whoever else. And so I'm really excited to execute and take on bigger challenges over the next 3 to 5 years. And allow my, cognitive mental state to just remain, very steady. Whereas I think before 2 years ago, I would have taken on more challenges and taken on more cognitive load as a result.
That's something to be excited about, because it's a challenge worth learning and mastering, and something I still have to really be on point and on guard about, to not let myself slip into the stress mode, because I am always adding to my plate, and always like you, probably just wanting to do more and accomplish more and impact more, and it's all good stuff. But it's not good if we can't be where our feet are, and we can't, be in the moment with our family or our friends, like you were saying. So that's super important. Speaking of your podcast and wanting to grow that, where can our listeners who may want to connect with you or follow along on your journey, where can they connect with you? Maybe the name of your podcast. I know you've got a couple, maybe whatever you want to share. Now's your time. I'd love to let you do that.
Yeah. So my personal podcast is called Momentum with Steve Borden on any streaming platform. And the other podcast would be a podcast I do through SAGA, my work through SAGA and VALD. If you're very interested in the narrow topic of blood flow restriction, it's on that, which is the product that we sell. So yeah, both those podcasts are there. And then all my social medias are just Stephen Borden, Stephen with a V.
All right. Right on. Well, hey, this has been fun. I've learned a few things. I always love learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I love to teach and I love to learn. So I think I love to learn even more than I love to teach. But I'm going to give you any closing comment, any last word you may want to share with our listeners before we call it a wrap.
Man, thanks for having me. These conversations, I hope that there's somebody that maybe has similar background, or we were talking earlier, there's just certain things that sometimes a message hits from a specific person. So maybe there's one or two people out there that if it hits, and that's like why I do this. I know it's why you do it as well. It's really cool to see people be excited about steps that they've taken that they were maybe previously afraid to take or paralyzed to take. So yeah, thanks for the time. This has been cool.
If you love this podcast, grab some of Alan's free resources on his website at alanblain.com, spelled ALLANBLAIN.com. You can also find links to Alan's Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok there in his contacts page. Lastly, if you can leave a 5-star review for us on your favorite podcast app, that will get these messages out to more people, and it will really mean the world to us. Thanks in advance, and make it a great day.